Hello, everyone. I'm Maria Massa, Director of Social Media and Digital Partnerships for the Walt Disney Birthplace, and I'm here today with our very special guest, Marcy Carriker Smothers, author of several books about Walt Disney, including Eat Like Walt, The Wonderful World of Disney Food. She's an expert in food, wine, and Disney and loves writing about that. She's a big supporter of the Walt Disney Birthplace and has a book of her own out in the front of the house to show her support, so we are incredibly thankful to her for that. Before we get started, I wanted to let our fans know that we have a special surprise with Marcy at the end, so make sure you stay tuned. And without further ado, let's welcome Marcy. Hi, Marcy. How are you doing?
I'm good, Maria. Thanks for having me. How are you?
Doing well. Why don't we start off with you telling our fans a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in Walt and Disney food?
It goes back to Disneyland, and I grew up in Southern California, and going to Disneyland was always my favorite day of the year. We only got to go once. My grandparents took us, and we would, leave really early and be waiting in the parking lot before it opened. And no matter how tired, anyone was, we stayed till midnight. And my grandfather used to bring his library books. He was a voracious reader, and a blanket, and put it on the curve of Main Street so we could see the parade, and that, he would stake out the spot, So I've always loved Disneyland, but my professional career started in radio, and I did several shows, including one with Guy Fieri called Food Guy and Marcy. And that did really well. We were in about 30 markets across the country, and then the recession happened, so that ended. But one door closes, another opens. I got a book deal with HarperCollins based on a radio feature I did with Guy to promote our show, and I would say things like, why should you take a bath with your strawberries? What does your dog's toy and an artichoke have in common? And, then Guy would come in and say, have a snack with Food Guy and Marcy, sponsored by. And quickly those answers are, if you get really great strawberries from the patch, right? Like not the strawberries from the supermarket, which are different. There was a very famous scientist, Harold McGee, that figured out that if you put them in very, very hot tap water for about 30 seconds, it prolongs their shelf life 2 to 3 days, because cold impedes mold growth, and so does heat. And when it comes to artichokes, if you put them next to your ear, a really fresh, well-hydrated artichoke will squeak. If you don't hear a squeak, then it's dry, there's no butter, there's no aioli that's ever gonna save the artichoke. And so that was called Adventures in Food, Aisle by Aisle. And after that book came out, my agent said to me, well, what do you want to write about next? And I said, the food at Disneyland. And he said, it was not the reaction I wanted, but it was an important reaction. He said, what are you possibly going to do that's different than Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat? I mean, everyone's posting food. What's there left to do than post beautiful food? That was an excellent question. So then I started thinking about Disneyland and the culinary history. Had anyone ever written about it? And I'm searching and Googling, and it had never been written about. And then I got more curious. Had Walt intended the food experiences at Disneyland to be immersive and entertaining, just like the attractions? And so doing my research for my proposal, I found an insert for an Orange County newspaper where Walt said, welcome to the kingdom of good eating, where the food is as fabulous as the fun. Like Adventureland and Fantasyland, dining at Disney is an attraction unto itself. I still get goosebumps. And then I knew that I had a book, right? So in fact, the original title was The Kingdom of Good Eating. But after I sold it to Disney, and I wrote a lot at Disneyland for my audience, with my audience, I'm just a geek, the lucky person that gets to write this book. And I loved being there because you can feel Walt's, you can feel his DNA. I'm sure at the Birthplace, same thing, there's something about being where he was. And he loved Disneyland so much. And so I started using the hashtag Eat Like Walt whenever I was having lunch. And pretty soon my editor said to me at Disney Editions, Wendy Lefcon, that's kind of catching on, Eat Like Walt. So that's how the book got its name. Once I sold it to Disney, I got into the Walt Disney Archives. And let me tell you, it is everything you think it is. It's like Christmas. You make a list of all the things you want to see, and then you sit down and they bring you boxes, and you open them and you find out if it's what you wanted. And so in my case, the food history of Disneyland, no one had ever written about it, nor thought to save much. So there was a lot of digging, a lot of interviewing. Everybody in the book knew Walt, no exceptions, no third person. And then something happened. I had sold the book about the culinary history of Disneyland, but once I got into the archives and I started learning about the restaurants there that Walt had at his studio, and when it opened in 1940, his previous studios like Lifograms and Hyperion didn't have commissaries, so they would go off the lot for lunch and dinner. He had 4 state-of-the-art restaurants when that studio opened, And Walt was only 39 years old then. And interestingly, he had the food subsidized. Like we think about that with Silicon Valley now, but he was way ahead of his time. And he knew that if he had really great food for fair prices on the studio lot, make happier employees and also more productive. So that added a chapter, Walt at Studio. And next, the family. The Diane Disney Miller had passed away when I had started this book, but I'd spoken to her several times because I live in the wine country, Sonoma County, and Silverado Winery is in Napa. It's 40 minutes away. And I know Jenny Goff, one of Walt's granddaughters, just around town, you know. So we had become kind of casual friends. And so when I sold the book, I didn't know how to tell Jenny that I sold it. I thought maybe she was going to think I'd been stalking her because, you know, this is her grandpa. And we would be going out to dinner before I even thought of a book, I think. And she would say, and grandpa. And I would always kind of, you know, do one of these, like, she's talking about Walt Disney, you know. And she didn't know what a geek I am at the time. So finally, after a million attempts and deletions, I sent the email to her. You know, dear Jenny, I sold a book. It's called Eat Like Walt. And it's the culinary history of Disneyland and Walt Disney. And she wrote back and said, there's no one else we would want to write it. So that was super sweet. And so Jenny met with me, so did Tam, so did Ron several times, Ron Miller. I talked a lot to Joanna by email. And then I had something that I'd never expected, the Walt at Home chapter. And that for sure is my big surprise and probably my thing that I'm most proud of because no one's ever talked about these things before. What was it like at the Disney family home? Walt came home all the time for dinner. He kind of eschewed, you know, the fancy red carpet parties. He did go out to eat. In fact, I have a list. That's another interesting story. The archives helped me. It took them a long time. They went through all of Walt's desk diaries from the 30s all the way up till he passed away and sent me a list of every restaurant that Walt had ever been noted to go to. And then I have that chapter in Eat Like Walt, dining outside of Disneyland, even the ones that are closed, but the ones that are open, famously like the Tam O'Shanter that you could still go to that Walt went to. And so the recipes in Eat Like Walt, all of the recipes are authentic to Walt, whether at home, the studio, or at Disneyland. Also, the book is a time capsule purposely of Walt's life. So it actually ends in 1967, even though Walt passed away in 66, because that's when Pirates of the Caribbean and the Blue Bayou and Club 33 opened, that he never lived to see happen. And so back to the family chapter and what you guys do in Chicago with Walt's Birthplace and where it all ties in is there's a lot of really wonderful stories about Walt and how he ate first in his childhood, which sort of dictated everything going into the future. When he was very young, they were very poor and they ate extremely simply, a lot of, you know, food that was not fancy, and Walt never outgrew that. He always had a simple palate. After Chicago, of course, went to Marceline, and in Marceline is where one of my favorite stories of Flora, Elias, and Walt, along with the brothers and Ruth and Roy, of course, is that, well, Elias wasn't the best farmer. You know, it wasn't his strong suit. They're having some problems making money on the farm, even though if you don't know it, for those that don't know, Marceline is in Missouri. And even though Walt was there not quite 5 years, I believe, he called it the happiest time of his life. And it shaped his boyhood. He called it his boyhood home. So much so that Diane Disney Miller said later on, and with respect to Chicago and respect to Kansas City, he was always talking about Marceline, and they didn't know that it was such a short period of time because the way he talked about it was so big in his life and so seminal in Walt's life. But anyway, back to Marceline when he was a little boy, and the farm things weren't going well. They would go around, they'd sell the apples from the farm, but what really made money was Flora's wonderful butter. She made this sweet, creamy butter. And Roy and Walt would take it into town and they would sell it. And it sold out all the time. It was very popular, and it was so popular that Elias said that the family was not supposed to eat that butter. They should be selling it all. He almost forbade the kids from having their mother's own butter. So what Elias didn't know is that Flora used to butter the bottom of the bread and pass it to the kids. And Elias never knew it. And there's a wonderful, it's owned actually by the Walt Disney Family Museum, but in the Pete Martin interviews, I've been able to hear that when Walt's describing the, you know, the butter story going into town, and then finally sitting at the dinner table when his mother is passing the tea. He goes, we're all loaded up and Dad had no idea. You know?
That is an awesome story.
And I love that because I think it's just a way, food is a way to connect with Walt. A lot of people say, like, how did you come up with that idea? Well, other than the culinary history, which is, I explained, the other thing about food, because I have done food and wine, radio, and television and writing for a long time before Disney, is everybody eats, you know, and it's extremely relatable. And because he was one of the world's, and still is, one of the world's most famous men, he was, as so many people would say who knew him, he was just human. In fact, you heard, that's the first thing that Ron Miller said to me. He said, I'm going to wreck your book. And I'm like, what? He goes, he was human. He was just a human being. And then I've read that and heard those interviews on and on. Just an extraordinary, wonderful, ordinary man.
Absolutely. That is awesome. You sound like you've had a wonderful career and it's led to all kinds of different paths and open doors. So I'm glad we have you here today to talk a little bit more about that. And you're right, Walt had the first meals of his life at the Walt Disney Birthplace. So even though he lived in California for a long time, his tastes were definitely driven by his Midwestern roots. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
What's really one of the treasure things that is in the book, and it's more to your point about those Midwestern tastes that shaped his life, that he never grew up out of. I mean, even if he was served steak, he didn't want to have a steak. He'd rather have something super simple, is that this is one of my favorite stories at the At Home. So there was a housekeeper in the Disney family home. Her name was Thelma Pearl Howard. And her nickname was Foo-Foo because Walt and Lillian's first grandchild, Christopher, couldn't say Thelma, so it came out Foo-Foo, and that stuck. Walt referred to her as his Mary Poppins. And Ron explained to me in detail how for 30 years Foo-Foo was the housekeeper and cook, long after Walt passed away, by the way. She made everything from scratch and cleaned the house, and all the Miller grandkids would be in the kitchen with her, and she'd never get, you know, flustered. She could cook with them, and she'd sing. And Tam describes the story of when Foo-Foo had the turkey for Thanksgiving, and she wrapped it up in a baby blanket and ran around the kitchen, poor turkey, you know. So they all have such fantastic memories of Foo-Foo. Well, Walt made a list of his favorite foods, and he gave it to Thelma to use, and she made it a reference point and hung it on the Disney family home refrigerator of his favorite foods. And they are things like Spam and eggs, roast chicken, hash, you know, a fruit, only one vegetable. That's my favorite, only one vegetable. And it's a detailed list of what he'd like to eat. And I think everything you would recognize as Midwestern, along with canned foods. Walt loved canned foods and shipped them when he traveled. Again, because that is what was familiar to him. Vienna sausages, V8 juice, Spam, he would take with him on his adventures around the world, because even though he could have room service and he could have a private chef with him if he wanted, he could eat at the finest restaurants, he still ultimately preferred those foods that he grew up with, starting in Chicago, moving on to Marceline, Kansas City, and then of course to California.
That's awesome. Yeah, we know that Walt was a big fan of chili. Our friends at D23 gave us a recipe to try to recreate his favorite chili recipe, and I know you mentioned some of Walt's other favorite foods in your book. What were some of his favorite foods? What recipes do you have of Walt from the 1930s or even earlier than that, and which ones have been your favorite?
Well, all of them are, again, very simple. So I have to say I've tested them all. I'm not sure I have a lot of favorites that, other than doing my Eat Like Walt dinners, that I love. Chili, first of all, at D23, we have 2 recipes for Walt's chili. We have the one that's been in the parks and D23 has shared, and I've done a lot of interviews about it. But I'm pretty sure the original recipe came much earlier than that version, because I found it in a cookbook called Kings in the Kitchen. It has suet in it. It has more Depression era type ingredients than the one that we associate with the parks in D23. But anyway, both those recipes are in Eat Like Walt, and you can compare and contrast. But going back, the earliest recipe, I did get recipes that were in Walt's file at the studio for things like clam chowder and soft gingerbread pudding, marshmallow pudding. Those are all in the book. But the first published one I found was in Better Homes and Gardens. I think it was 1934. And it was called Macaroni Mickey Mousse. And everyone thinks it's a typo. If you read about it, they think mousse, and they mean macaroni Mickey Mouse. No, a mousse isn't just a dessert. It can mean a molded casserole. And so this recipe, it has Walt's photograph on it. I have an image actually from Better Homes and Gardens, thanks to them, they let me share it, talking about how he likes it. And it's essentially a cheese sauce with what I'm pretty sure Walt would have used, long spaghetti that would have been broken up. And then if you want to spruce it up, you added some bacon. So that's Macaroni and Mickey Mouse Mousse, excuse me. And I think that's probably going back the furthest, excuse me. But the one I think that really surprised me was they're called Chinese candy cookies. They're basically a haystack cookie. Again, extremely popular in mid-century America. I had found another cookbook that is somewhat obscure. I know some people know about it. It's called 5-Star Favorites. But you would have had to have known, and it was a cookbook from an auxiliary, a hospital auxiliary in Palm Springs. I mean, now we're getting super geeky with my research, trying to find anything Walt food. And you would have had to have known that Lillian had remarried Mr. John Truyans, because this recipe is not attributed to Lillian Disney, it's attributed to Mrs. John Truyans. And what gave it away to me is there's 2 recipes in the book. And the first one is Chris's cold pie. Well, Chris's cold pie has been served at the parks for years. So then I started looking, I compared it to the original version that has been in the park cookbooks. It was the same one. And then I Googled it, that's Lillian. So I thought I was done. And then I just looked in the back of the book and there was this recipe for the Chinese candy cookies. And essentially it's super easy. I think it's on eatlikewalt.com. I have several recipes, by the way, for free. If anyone can go to eatlikewalt.com. And it's butterscotch, melted butterscotch chips, the good old-fashioned chow mein noodles, Chinese chow mein noodles, and dry roasted peanuts. So I started Googling, butterscotch, haystack cookies, and never came up. So I figured out, okay, this recipe is unknown it's unknown. It's never been published before. So the first time I met with Jenny and Ron to talk about the book, it was in Napa, and I made those cookies. And I presented them to Jenny, and that even makes me cry now. She started crying and said, "You made my grandpa's cookies," and she hadn't seen them for so long. And she said, even after Grandpa died, Fufu made those and wrapped them in wax paper, and we always had them in the cookie jar. So we know that Walt really liked these cookies, and we know they have a deep connection to the family. So that was something else that kind of goes back to the Midwestern taste, and something that brings us all close to Walt, because we could eat what Walt liked to do and eat more than just the chili. There's so much more than just the chili.
Absolutely. That must have been amazing, finding that piece of Disney history and putting all together. I mean, that's some serious detective work. So nice job there, Marcy. That's great. Do we know anything about what Flora Disney, Walt's mother, and Elias Disney, Walt's father, would have made for their family? What kind of meals would they have made for themselves when living in Chicago? Do we have any information available?
I wish I knew, and I've learned to say, as a historian, I've only been doing this 4 years, by the way. So this is my, this was my first book for Disney and only my second book. I have to say, I don't know. I've been to Marceline, and it was a wonderful pilgrimage. I cannot wait to come visit you guys when you open in Chicago. And it would be kind of like you would probably think, simple farm foods, what they could raise and eat. And I know they raised apples. Walt talks about sausage in some of his transcripts that I've read, probably a very simple sausage, but I can't say with certainty what they ate. One thing I do know, though, in Marceline is very sweet, as Elias played the fiddle, as I know he played it first on the porch there at the Walt Disney's Birthplace. I've seen the fiddle at the Walt Disney Family Museum in San Francisco, and I went to the Disney family home in Marceline where Elias played that fiddle. That was really cool, because it ties up all of what you guys are doing and preserving Walt's history around the country, the 3 of the museums that are tribute to Walt. I love that I was able to see that.
Yeah, the Walt Disney Family Museum has some amazing pieces. They've been a really great partner to the Birthplace, and we very much encourage folks to go visit when it's safe to do so. And like you said, Marcy, the fiddle is one of the pieces that connects Walt's early life together, so seeing the fiddle in person is really, really cool. Elias was such a present figure throughout Walt's life, so especially so when he was young, and it's just really cool to see it in person, so highly recommend. So what are you working on now? I know that you had mentioned off air to me, Marcy, that you had a couple of interesting projects in the works.
I do. I am staying, and thank you for asking, I'm staying firmly in the space of Disneyland and Walt's era. Now, the next book is called Walt's Disneyland, A Walk in the Park with Walt Disney. And it's a guide, which is a loose word to say because it's so much work. It'll look like a Birnbaum guide, which is great, but it's not about facts. It's not, there's so many wonderful Disneyland books that have been written. I didn't want to start on them. There's too many excellent fact books. This is a book about feelings, how Disneyland makes you feel. And I think what Walt wanted you to feel. And there is looking at things. I've shown this to Imagineers and they'll say, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. So I'm really kind of having fun uncovering things about the park that you may be walking past and never knew had a connection to Walt. And the big things that you know have a connection to Walt, maybe you'll learn something new about them. I have something about the Pirates Caribbean that's just, I don't think it's ever been put out there before. But even if it has been put out there before, it's for everybody, whether it's the first time they're going to Disneyland or the 100th time. But I want it to be about Walt's legacy and preserving Disneyland. So while we can't make Disneyland a museum, and that's been said, I don't work for Disney. I'm an independent contractor, just a passionate writer, and I love my subject. But they say at Imagineering all the time, Disneyland cannot be a museum. And of course, Walt famously said it would always be changing. But the thing that I feel that I'm going to do in my little teeny tiny piece with my book is I believe that Walt would have preserved it as a crown jewel. He knew about Walt Disney World then being Disney World, of course. He called it Disney World after he passed away. Roy said, for now on, it's going to be Walt Disney World. There would not be a Disney World without Walt. So my friends know that I'm very strict. We don't call it Orlando. We don't call it Florida. We don't call it Disney World. It's Walt Disney World. But for a Disneyland, I just want to do my part of preserving Walt's legacy. And it's just, oh, I love it. So that comes out in November of next year. Ironically, when we first started with all this, it was going to come out on Disneyland's birthday, which is July 17th. It's their 65th birthday. So I'm grateful that it's coming out next year. And the other book is about Walt Disney World. I hadn't expected. A lot of my friends were always saying after Eat Like Walt came out, it came out in 2017, September. I will say I'm very proud. Probably my thing that I'm most proud of as Marcy is that it made the New York Times New and Noteworthy. So anyway, was I going to write about Walt Disney World? And I never really didn't know what I would possibly write because I'm a Disneyland person. Well, you know, as time goes on, I'm going to Walt Disney World. I'm giving talks. Everybody at Walt Disney World is so hungry to learn about Walt, you know, and so it was fun giving cast member talks there, also giving, you know, guest talks at Walt Disney World. I think I've done that now 3 times. So I had a whole new appreciation for Walt Disney World. And everybody would always ask me, well, what do you know, how do you compare? I'm like, well, you can't. But I say that Disneyland is the crown jewel and Walt Disney World's a treasure chest. It's abundant with the jewels overflowing. So now I met Pam Brandon. And if any of you have any of the other Disney cookbooks, particularly from Walt Disney World, Pam would have been the author. I think she's done 23 cookbooks, mostly about Walt Disney World. And we had a lot of friends in common. And last year in October, when I was at Walt Disney World working, we had breakfast that turned into lunch. And she said, do you ever want to collaborate? I'm like, well, I've got this major book I'm doing, A Walk in the Park with Walt Disney. And I started thinking about it. And of course, Walt Disney World's 50th anniversary is coming up of October next year. So I thought maybe we could collaborate on something that's about the 50th. So that's what we're doing. It's a cookbook of try to pick out 80 or 90 recipes that represent 50 years of Walt Disney World. Is tough, but yeah, so we're trying to do that, and that will come out at the hopefully around the October birth date for Walt Disney World next year.
That's awesome, really exciting, and some nice things to look forward to in 2021.
A lot to do now, but yeah, next year, you know, I'm grateful for it, and I hope everyone's, you know, I think that I have found with the Disney community, however you are, parks, movies, merchandise, whatever you're a fan of, collector, watcher, reader, it's been so helpful as we've gone through this in the world and the country to have Disney to make things happier and brighter. And, you know, and thanks to social media, I mean, I love seeing the people that have recreated the attractions. I love seeing what people are cooking and tagging to Eat Like Walt or Eat Like the Parks. It's just, it's been for me sort of my salvation is Disney, you know, during this since March has kept me happy.
Definitely. I think a lot of people out there feel the same way. Yeah, and it's all great points you've made. Like food connects us to Walt. All anyone has to do is to go to your website to get more information about the food that he ate. Can you let us know what your website is?
Sure. Well, I have 2, but eatlikewalt.com has everything about the book. It has several recipes, including the Chinese candy cookies that you can make right away. It's so simple. It's 3 ingredients. It won't take you long. And then I also have my same as my Instagram and my Twitter. It's food Wine Marcy, M-A-R-C-Y. So foodwinemarcy.com is the website. That has a broader look at all the different projects that I'm doing. And that's how you find me on Insta and on Twitter.
Well, cool. I know that you just sort of started off diving into all this Disney stuff the last 4 years, more formally as an author. So with that said, you know, the Walt Disney Birthplace is funded by the nonprofit, the Center for Early Childhood Creativity and Innovation. And we are always trying to encourage creativity in children, especially young children. Do you have any advice for parents seeking to nurture innovation and creativity in their children, or any advice for young kids on how they could hone their skills if they are aspiring to be future writers?
That's such a good question, because I wanted to be a writer when I was little, and I wrote books, and I remember taping them together. And then that kind of got sucked out of me, college reality. I ended up going a whole other path, which was in casting and television production and then radio. So coming back to writing was a pure joy for me when the first book was published in 2013. So what to do? Well, parents, and I do with my kids, is reading is fundamental. You know, reading to your kids. And I think, you know, the idea of, in my opinion, you know, you don't sit a kid down to read when the family sits together to read, even if you're reading individual books. That modeling of how important books are, that's what I tried to do. My grandparents never graduated high school, just like Walt. Yet they both played Scrabble every single night, and they did the New York Times crossword puzzle in ink, and they read voraciously from the library, all those things that help with the reading. So I think, which is part of reading. So I think reading is number one, because even for writers, you read for inspiration. You don't know you're getting inspiration, but it's working back there. And then in terms of writing, yeah, I mean, I think getting out, making the book kits. I mean, now there's so much out there, you're right, that you could actually get kits and make a book, or take photos and send them to your Walgreens or your CVS, and you can illustrate them and they'll assemble them with photographs. I just think you sit and you do it. And I think that really, it's harder with kids because, you know, if they writing, I think they either do or they don't want to do. Like my son is a writer, and now my daughter is a writer. They both like to write. However, for adults, you know, I get that question all the time. And Ubers, you know, I've got a book in me. I hear that all the time. Just like a lot of people probably say to chefs, you know, I've always wanted to open a restaurant. And I say the same thing that so many really, really smart people, smarter than me, way before me, said, is writers write. You know, you sit down and you write. And it's not easy most of the time, and it requires a lot of discipline, and it's hard. But so going back to kids, if your kid wants to write, encourage that, encourage it. Give them the, you know, if they can't write it out, you write it out for them. And I think it's really important, lastly, to do something tangible that they can look back at, that it looks like a book, and it's their book that they wrote.
Awesome. This was wonderful, Marcy. So for now, our special surprise, we are giving away Eat Like Walt, one of Marcy's books that she's talked about on this piece, to one lucky follower. So make sure that you're following us on our social media and tag a few friends in the comments of the post to enter. So special thanks to Marcy for making this giveaway possible, and really, really happy that you were able to be here today, Marcy. Thank you so much for your time, and talk
Thanks,
soon.
Maria. I really appreciate being invited, and I cannot wait to get to Chicago. By the way, one of my best friends is from Chicago, and I don't want to be a shameless name dropper, but I think everyone loves her in Chicago, Bonnie Hunt, actress, director.
Oh, yeah.
She's one of my best friends, and so I cannot wait to come to Chicago and see Bonnie and to see the museum, the home. I call it, do you call it a museum? Because it's his birthplace, right? So do you refer to it as a?
We call it the Birthplace. It's technically going to be a museum, but it's not going to be one of those traditional velvet rope type museums where you can't touch anything. We want it to be very immersive. And right now we're in the stage where we have restored it nicely, and we're looking to add period furniture and put in some magical immersive elements so that we can actually open it to the public. But we're really excited about the progress that we've made, and so thankful for supporters like you for buying a brick, buying merchandise. I mean, it all really goes back to the Birthplace, and we wouldn't be able to do this project without you. So thank you so much, not just for the time today, but for the ongoing support. We really appreciate it.
Well, you can count on me, and I cannot wait to be there when you guys open to the public. But in the meantime, everyone stay safe, and if you can, eat like Walt.
Absolutely. Thank you, Marcy.
Thank you.